Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is December 8th, 2016, and before introducing today's guest, I want to encourage listeners to go to econtalk.org. You'll find a link there to vote for your favorite episodes of 2016 and give us some additional feedback. Thank you so much. Now on to today's guest, who is Robert Hall, the Robert and Carol McNeil Joint Hoover Senior Fellow and Professor of Economics at Stanford University. In addition to having published widely in many areas of macroeconomics and beyond, Bob is the chair of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Committee on Business Cycle Dating, which maintains the semi-official chronology of the U.S. business cycle. That is, Bob is the chair of the committee that decides when recessions start and when they end. Bob, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you.
I want to start by discussing a recent paper of yours that we'll link to, The Anatomy of Stagnation in a Modern Economy. And I'm going to read the opening paragraph. It's pretty blunt and dramatic. In the years following the global financial crisis of 2008, many modern advanced economies suffered stagnation. Unemployment rose sharply and declined slowly. Output fell substantially and growth remained substandard even 8 years later. Investment in plant equipment, software, and research and development languished. Productivity grew well below its historical rate. Monetary and fiscal measures to offset these developments were aggressive but were only partially successful. This paper studies these events as they occurred in the single largest advanced economy, that of the USA, end quote. Now, a lot of people have argued that while fiscal and monetary policy were only partially successful, that's simply because they just weren't aggressive enough. Do you agree?
Well, first of all, with respect to monetary policy, the standard policy of lowering interest rates was done about as aggressively as possible. Maybe not quite, but pretty close. With respect to fiscal policy, really a lot happened, but it happened mainly because of the what are called the automatic stabilizers. Discretionary fiscal policy, as in previous contractions, was not politically feasible, it turned out. So I think I would probably agree that in some ideal world, more would have been done on the fiscal side.
So when you look at the stimulus package of the early days of the Obama administration, which was, I don't know, what ended up being around $800 billion, why is that was not a significant amount?
Well, first of all, it turned a large amount of that money went to state and local governments, and rather than expanding their fiscal effects, a lot of the governments used it to pay off debt, understandably. But if you stare at the national income accounts on the government purchases of state and local governments, you don't see any sign whatsoever. In fact, you see a contraction. So calling it $800 billion is a bit of a myth in terms of what was actually delivered as stimulus to the economy.
And another good chunk of it was a tax rebate that it's interesting to me. There's this myth that it was all these shovel-ready infrastructure projects. I don't particularly think that would have necessarily been a good idea or successful, but it's not what we did.
I think that's right. So if you look at the national income and product accounts at the category that would include these supposedly shovel-ready projects, you just don't see an expansion. Remember that most of that type of spending is done by state and local governments, not by the federal government. So the fact that the federal government couldn't articulate a change in what the other government units were doing came through very clearly. But all research of every contraction has shown that the same thing happens. So this is not really a surprise.
When you say the same thing, what do you mean?
I mean that the federal government would like to expand the economy by inducing state and local governments to spend more, but they don't have the tools to do it. At least they have neither the political will nor the tools to make it happen. And so there's a long literature, as long as I've been an economist, which is a long time, that shows that discretionary policy aimed at increasing government purchases like infrastructure just don't work, or if they do work, they don't start stimulating the economy until it no longer needs it. There's some work that shows that it's actually perverse because it takes so long to get the spending cranked up. If it ever does, it's when the economy is back into a boom condition.
So what do you see as the set of factors that explains the mediocrity of this recovery? The fact that, as you say, 8 years into it, into the recovery, we see very little recovery or improvement in investment. The labor market, a lot of people have suggested it's been very disappointing. Even though unemployment's low, labor force participation is low. What do you think explains it?
Well, the two big factors, you just mentioned one of them, labor force participation, totally unexpectedly fell several percentage points, at least 3 percentage points, more than you'd expect, even given the deep recession. So that's one factor. Even more important is simply the slowdown in productivity growth. We've had productivity growth, but at much lower rates, and that's just fundamental to the amount of output. I've studied the labor market pretty carefully, and I'm convinced, and other papers that I've written recently make the argument that the labor market really is back to absolutely normal conditions. The unemployment rate of 4.6% is well below the long-run average of 5.9% for unemployment. Some key factors like how long it takes an employer to fill a job. It takes longer than it ever has before to fill a typical job. That's a sign of a tight labor market. So at this point, we can't say that there's a lingering effect in the labor market, but there are other lingering effects which are quantified in that paper you mentioned.
What do you think of the work of Casey Mulligan, who's been a guest on the program, talking about the impact of changes in various welfare programs and their implicit marginal tax rates that have discouraged workers?
Well, I think philosophically, I agree with a lot of the points he's made, which is that we've created a system where people become dependent on programs, lose their benefits so aggressively that they become trapped. It just doesn't make sense to enter the labor market, even though it's back to normal, because of losing benefits. And there was a big expansion of benefits, which has not completely gone back to normal as a result. Casey's numbers are in some ways hard to interpret. I wouldn't want to endorse. Certainly, the theme of his book, which was the entire recession was caused by it, does not square with anything I've looked at. What I see is that about 8 million people suddenly lost their jobs, mostly in the late fall of 2008 and the first half of 2009, and that was a major factor. Working that off was actually very time-consuming, and there's no way that it makes sense to say that those people suddenly lost their jobs because there was some increase in benefits and they quit their jobs. We know they didn't quit their jobs. So that part of it, I think is in my analysis overblown. But still, the need for reform of benefit programs, disability, probably the most important one, is very acute. And there's just agreement across the board in economists at that point.
Yeah, related to that, do you see the long secular decline, secular meaning over time, decline over time in prime age male labor force participation to be explained in part or in large part by that expansion of disability opportunities, or is it something else going on? Is it people's skills? People are worried that, these are manufacturing workers, a lot of them who will not find good alternatives and are not returning to the labor market in the normal way.
It's a combination of all the things you mentioned, probably some more. First of all, it's among men. It's a very long-term phenomenon.
Yeah.
Labor force participation was much higher in 1950, and then it's among among men, and it's declined, a pretty smooth trend. Whereas the situation for women is quite different. There was a big increase in participation among women, and then about 10 to 15 years ago, that changed, and we've seen some decline of participation by women. But work has become less common, and particularly work among young people. The most stunning fact is that about in the year 2000, not that long ago, about half of all teenagers at any given time were working. Today, it's less than 25%. So there's been a decline in half of the fraction of teenagers who are employed. That's the most extreme number, but you see the same thing among, say, the 20 to 24-year-olds, and you see it among older men especially. And that's very tied in with evidence about the declining health in those age groups, and the absorption by disability, there was a bulge of people going on to disability, which has not reversed itself. Going on disability is pretty much a trap in the sense that relatively few people who make that decision and are qualified then exit.
Yeah, we had Eric Hurst on recently talking about you mentioned teenagers. He finds that in his work with some co-authors, I think it's 21 to 30-year-olds who are not in school. I think 18% did not work in the previous year compared to 10, 15 years. I can't remember the time frame, but it's a short time frame, and a lot of these folks are living at home.
Playing video games.
That's what he says. I don't know.
I know.
I'm not sure.
I follow the progress of that paper.
Yeah, I don't know.
In detail.
I'm a little bit skeptical, but let's move to, or at least I'm skeptical that video games driving the change, which is what I'm sure some of them were playing video games while they're at home. Let's go to productivity growth, which you said is sort of the crux of the matter. A lot of people have argued recently, or at least a lot of prominent people have argued recently, that the reason investment is down and productivity is down is because we've figured out all the interesting and productive things to invest in. What's your view on that hypothesis? And if you disagree, what do you look for to think about it?
Yeah, so Greg Gipp had an article in yesterday's Wall Street Journal that it's such a tired old story, and we have surges of productivity. There was productivity pessimism, say around 1990, similar to what there is today, and similar saying, all the good ideas have already been implemented, and then the internet came along and gave this remarkable, or things like it.
But that was the last one. That was it. There was one left. We found it. Now it's over.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I gave a talk recently to a popular audience about computer vision and the changes that it makes. And for one example I showed in a video was the difference between the way trash used to be collected from households, which you'd have a truck with a team of 3 guys, 2 of whom rode outside and jumped off, emptied a trash bin, and then pushed a button, and then it went up, and then they would get back on and they would go to the next house. Today, the trash in most places, certainly where I live, is picked up by a truck that has 1 guy, and he barely stops. And then computer vision takes over. It spots your trash bin wherever it is. It reaches over. It adjusts for any mistakes that the driver made. Flips the trash at least 3 times more quickly than the guys could do it. So you have a 3-fold reduction in the number of people, from 3 to 1, and you have a tripling of the speed. So the productivity of collecting trash has gone up by a factor of 9. And that's just scratching the surface of what computer vision can do. The excitement about computer vision today is mainly the self-driving car, but there's so many other places. And it's a very, very intensive area of work by computer scientists. There's many, many tech startups now whose main mission is to improve computer vision, and the improvements that have been made just in the last few years are just stunning. So I don't know. I don't try to forecast, but I think this productivity pessimism. I emphasize productivity uncertainty, episodes like we've had recently of a slowdown in, say, over a 6-year period have been common. There's nothing statistically surprising about it, and they've typically been followed by productivity growth going to normal or even above normal. So we have waves of productivity pessimism, and then we have waves of productivity optimism. And that's what I've seen, and I've been watching this for quite a while.
Well, your remark about the trash pickup reminds me not, at my current weight level, to stand near the curb as the trucks go by. Could be mistaken. You know, I know it's not. They're still getting some of the bugs out, I'm sure. I wouldn't want to be picked up by mistake. But it's an example of where technology is being applied, and it may or may not be showing up in the data. What do you think of this argument that, say, in GDP, so many of the pleasures of life for the last 10 years are not very monetized, and we're not measuring a lot of the gains correctly in the national income accounts?
Okay, well, Chad Syverson at Chicago has written a very interesting paper. We're giving, I think, what started out as a kind of a neutral evaluation of that point, and he showed using various arguments that sort of put an upper limit, and that our upper limit is pretty limited, and that the idea that we're somehow missing some huge benefits. Of course, we are,
but we always have.
But for example, the whole revolution in photography is not captured at all in our data. They still collect only. They still base statistics on the assumption that people are using film and sending it off to be developed.
Yeah.
And, I don't know. I wouldn't know where to go with film to be developed.
Yeah. Right. So, I spent $100 for a software program to develop on my computer. In fact, it's a one-time payment. They upgrade it every once in a while, but I take 10,000 photographs on my computer. I have about 10,000, and it's glorious.
I do exactly the same thing. Probably the same software. Exactly.
And it's not being measured. And certainly my pleasure from it's not being measured. Certainly the pleasure I get from not having to retake, only take 12 pictures and worry I got the right ones, that I can take 1,000 is just wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a very concrete example. But I think it's fair to say, when you look at what the economy produces and what we consume, there's just an awfully large number of things where we know nothing much has changed. Like the generation of electricity. Building houses is a great example. It's a very large budget share. It's a growing budget share for housing in the U.S. And houses are being built today with exactly the same technology virtually as they were 100 years ago. And it's not, it's a very big sector. It's much bigger than any of the ones that people are excited about, like photography. But it's not one where productivity growth has occurred. So you have to get realistic if you stare at the numbers for what we make. It's an awful lot of totally boring stuff where there's not much change in productivity going on or even possible.
So when you say you're not a pessimist or an optimist, that you're a realist is what I'd describe it. The fact that the last 8 years have been so disappointing, is that just you're saying that's just a standard kind of slowdown that happens in the data now and then, and not to be worried about it?
Well, I don't know. I hesitate to say that it's just, because it's received a lot of study. Like John Fernald at the San Francisco Fed has been kind of the highly knowledgeable expert on that point. And he's written a number of papers that everybody should read who's interested in this subject. But it seems like there was this period of rapid adoption of revolutionary information processing technology, and that's somewhat slowed down, oddly, because there's so many places that you deal with every day that could be immensely improved. Like the airline that I fly, that I won't name, has has a ridiculously bad website, a notoriously bad website, and just if they could just hire the right people who are numerous, especially in Silicon Valley, to write a decent website, it would be a huge step forward for all of us. So it just hasn't happened, and we sit there waiting. Every single time you enter anything, it does a whole page load. Nobody writes websites that way today. That's just pathetic. That's the website of 1995, 20 years ago. So,
well, the cost of revamping that website, the time it would take, and I guess they don't think those 3 seconds for that reload, which are annoying to us, are going to be that valuable, and they don't think they can capture that monetary gain. Maybe, I don't know.
I don't know, but it's odd because the companies that grew up with the web, especially Amazon. Why doesn't Amazon start an airline? It seems to me that would just be perfect.
Well, they're
because
close.
They've got.
They're really close, actually.
It wouldn't surprise me, by the way, if they did.
Nor I. One thing you haven't mentioned that we haven't talked about yet is interest rates. And one of the things that people have noticed, it's funny, it's been going on for decades, but we just sort of noticed it. At least some of us have. At least some people just started writing about it. They've been falling for a very, very long time, through both good times and bad times.
Well, that shows that you're younger than I am.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
In the first half of my career, they went up.
Well,
and
that's true.
They reached this spectacular peak around 1981. Yeah. No, 81. 81
okay.
was the and then it's been down from there.
But that's a long time.
A lot of that, of course, we're talking about nominal interest rates. So they were boosted a lot in the 70s by the growing inflation. Then when we had monetary policy that further increased it, we had just a double whammy of high interest rates. And then we got back to normal during the 80s. But then other things took over. We got inflation down, so it was no longer an important factor. But then other things, which resulted in declines in real interest rates. It's normally the case that when, first of all, interest rates are global. This phenomenon is all over the world, and world economic growth has slowed somewhat recently. It's not just the U.S. where it's slowed, but China, for example, a big factor in this is China. So declining growth is one thing, and there's others. I've just written a paper on this, which you're invited to read, of course.
Yeah, we'll put a link up to it. But isn't that just the flip side of this concern that the slowing of growth is a flip side of, I'll just say it's a puzzle. Normally after a recession, and certainly a recession of the magnitude we had in 2008, certainly the worldwide nature of it would be followed by a very brisk and dramatic recovery. We haven't seen that. Growth seems sluggish. What do we think's going on?
Okay, well,
when people ask me, I just say I don't know. It's easy for me. But
okay.
I have no idea is my answer.
I know something.
Yeah, tell me what you know.
Okay, so what I do know is that the labor market has behaved very much the way that it has historically. There was nothing very surprising about what happened in the labor market once you come to grips with the fact that it was a very large shock. So in terms of immediate job loss, it was by a considerable margin the worst. And then other factors
in a long time.
Yes, well, yeah, over the period since we measured unemployment, we just started in 1948. So that triggered this normally fairly long period in which unemployment gradually declines. But that's always been true. People always get excited about it because recessions don't happen very often. And for example, most reporters who are reporting on the Great Recession were not reporters when the previous recession occurred in 2001.
Correct.
But here are the numbers on job destruction. There were 8 million jobs destroyed, as I mentioned before, in late 2008 and early 2009. There were about 5 million jobs destroyed in the 2001 recession, which was actually a pretty bad recession from the job destruction point of view. But
mild in output.
Other things, it was followed. So the reason that so we had what amounts to a pretty structurally a pretty normal recession and recovery, except that it was really bad. So it was just scaled up, but qualitatively, it was all the same things that have happened in previous recessions. The thing that makes everybody think that the recovery was slow is not what we should be calling a recovery at all. It's what happens to productivity. Productivity doesn't systematically do one thing or another over the business cycle. Here, we had low productivity growth at the same time that we had a normally structured recovery from a very bad shock. So the combination gave an extended period going up to today of disappointing results. As of today, all the disappointment comes from things that are not related to recovery. The recovery is complete, but we're not where we'd like to be because productivity growth has been bad, and also because we have a legacy of not having formed much capital since 2007. And that's really hurting too. I mean, that was another of the big factors that was in the paper that you started this discussion with.
And to summarize that, so that's a nice way to think about it, right? Low capital formation and low productivity. Of course, in a way, they're almost saying the same thing. They're certainly related.
Not the way. If we're talking about what economists call total factor productivity.
Explain.
So it's the normally the economy grows faster than you'd expect, given the fact that normally employment is rising and capital is rising, but output rises even more than you'd expect, and that's what's called a residual. And the residual is also called total factor productivity. The total factor means that it's considering and giving credit to all factors, capital and labor, and not just labor. So when we talk about total factor productivity, it's already allowing, in this case, it's allowing for the fact that capital formation had been very weak. It's by some measures, it's back to normal today. It's very tricky to figure out what the right measure is, but there's still a legacy of capital that would have been formed if we hadn't had a severe recession, which wasn't. And that's a non-trivial part of the total.
So a lot of people want to blame a lack of investment on uncertainty of various kinds, policy uncertainty. We just had a two-term president who came in and overhauled the healthcare sector and financial regulation, two significant parts of the U.S. economy, and overhauled them in ways where the impact of it wasn't clear for a while. I think the legislation's still somewhat incomplete even today.
It's a question of whether it's viable.
Right.
The premiums are going up so rapidly that
there's also
non-viability is definitely an issue.
So a lot of people, certainly on this program, who share my free market views, have said, well, of course, economy's lousy or investment's lousy. It's because there's a lot of uncertainty. Well, my thought is, I'd love for that to be true for my biases, but there's always a lot of uncertainty. Now we have a president who's really uncertain about what policies are going to be put in place, and we'll see what is going to happen.
Yeah, right. Surely there's more uncertainty now than ever before.
Right.
But the stock market loves it.
Yeah,
so
right. So
I'm very familiar with that literature, and I certainly respect the people who've worked on it. But the connection, getting a direct sort of causal connection has proven to be elusive in that literature. What is true is that the 9/11, which my colleague has worked on, is actually a very interesting test of that proposition. In fact, it was the first thing that Bloom looked at. And what happened there was clearly an enormous rise in uncertainty right after 9/11. There was a brief period of diminished spending, investment, and consumption spending. And then people looked around and said, well, I guess not. And it occurred toward the end of a recession, and the economy behaved quite normally after that, and then we had a pretty good expansion through the end of 2007. So that was kind of a laboratory for that idea. It shows that the idea is valid, but on the other hand, the effect of what was kind of a transforming experience for many of us on the economy was remarkably small just after a few months.
Yeah.
By the way, there's another hypothesis floating around. The Council of Economic Advisors has a paper on its website pushing this idea that there's been a substantial increase in market power.
I saw that.
U.S. economy, and that translates directly into bad news on several fronts, including capital formation. Market power functions like a tax to discourage economic activity, and if it's true, so far, as market power is one of the topics I worked on 30 years ago, and found it remarkably elusive to measure. And I think there's kind of a presumptive case in favor of it. There has been some increase in concentration, but I think it's going to be an area of research. I think the policy uncertainty research is sort of done everything they can do, and they've done a lot, and I think they've convinced some people, perhaps not me. But I think this market power hypothesis is going to get a lot of attention as another thing that's holding back, and maybe even holding back productivity. To me, it's a somewhat more promising idea.
Well, let's shift gears to monetary policy. I ask my guests, and I get asked a lot by my friends, why banks are holding excess reserves in the magnitude that they are at the Fed. And I get asked this question. It's usually a related question, which is, if the Fed was so aggressive, why didn't we have inflation? And does that mean that Milton Friedman and others were wrong? And then people respond, it's because the banks are holding the money, and when the money goes out in the economy, it'll cause inflation. And yet I have not heard a good theory for why the banks are holding on to massive amounts of excess reserves rather than investing them, which is related somewhat to our previous discussion. So what are your thoughts on these issues?
Okay, well, first of all, the first question is easy to answer. The banking system as a whole has no choice about the level of reserves. It's completely dictated by the Federal Reserve. If one bank decides to invest its reserves, the reserves just land at another bank. It's a sealed system. There's a lot of misunderstanding at this point, but it's absolutely central to understanding monetary policy to understand that banks collectively have no choice whatsoever about their holding of reserves. It is completely determined on Constitution Avenue. So that's the first point to make.
You want to explain that? So the normal way that the story gets told is that the Fed intervened in 2008, 2009, I think even kept going, quantitative easing of various kinds. Sure. They bought a lot of assets that banks held, both government treasuries as well as mortgage-backed securities, and they paid for those by crediting those banks on the balance sheets that they have at the Fed with reserves that they could then lend out.
Yeah, a more instructive way to say that is they borrowed the funds from the commercial banks and used the proceeds to buy bonds. A lot of people don't understand that the process that you described is simply borrowing in the capital market. The Fed greatly expanded the national debt by issuing what are federal obligations, borrowing, which are reserves. It's as simple as that. It's just a bank. It gets funds from one source and it uses them to buy securities of a different type.
And so the expansion, the so-called quantitative easing, where'd that come from? Just that's electronic magic.
No, it's just as you described it. It's a conscious thing. The Federal Open Market Committee directs, as they like to say, the trading desk to start buying stuff. Every time they buy stuff, as you pointed out, they do it because they have this automatic right to borrow from the banking system by creating more reserves. So they write a check, so to speak, which is increasing reserves, and they use it to buy bonds.
But suggesting that the banks, which have statutory minimums of what they have to hold at the Fed, now hold, because of those actions, they have much larger amounts on the Fed balance sheet. And if they tried to lend those out to, say, homeowners and home purchasers, they can't do that they can't change that net. They can only.
Well, the system can't. Any one bank can. So one bank can say, "Oh, well, we don't like what they're getting today, which is 50 basis points, 0.5 of 1%."
That's the interest that the Fed's paying them for holding them there.
Exactly right. And they look around and that's completely safe. And they say, "What can we get on other safe investments?" Well, less than that. Okay, so they have absolutely no incentive, given the current state of the money market, to do anything. Now, suppose that.
But that's a separate point. That's a good point. I was going to get to that, but that's not the main point. Keep going.
Okay, but then if you ask, well, what would happen if Alan Blinder, who's been very vocal in the Wall Street Journal on this, and others, including me, but not so much in print, said, well, that's a silly policy. Let's change the 50 basis points to 0. Then banks would look around and they'd say, now I'd really like to invest. And so they would start, as you were saying, they'd say, I'm not getting the market return from reserves anymore. I'll try to get rid of them. But every time they try to get rid of them, which they do aggressively, but the reserves always land at some other bank, right? If you buy something, if you make a loan, then the funds are deposited in someone else's bank account, and then that means that the corresponding reserves are moved to that person's bank. There's nothing the system can do. One of the anomalies here is that for crazy reasons, which I won't go into and don't even fully understand myself, but I know that my colleagues do, a lot of the banks that the reserves under certain circumstances can be held by foreign banks, like Deutsche Bank in particular. So Deutsche Bank, at one time, I don't know if it's true now, was actually the single largest bank holder of excess reserves. And they were harvesting money from the American taxpayers because the Federal Reserve, for completely unexplained reasons, was paying more than the market rate. This paying it over the market rate went into effect in October of 2008 at exactly the wrong time. So, Blinder just sputters, and he's a very middle of the road kind of a guy. This is not political; it's just economics.
Well, it's a mystery to me too, and I want to. That was my next question, which is, there are two ways to ask the question. Which is, one, the question is, why did the Fed start paying interest on reserves? The standard economist answer is, and I know you've written a paper on it recently, and you're going to be talking about it shortly, is it was a new way it was a new instrument for the Fed to use in affecting monetary policy. For those of us who might not be economists, who might be political scientists or just everyday people, it looks like a way to take care of the banks through a tough time when they were had very troubled balance sheets. Economists don't like to give that answer, most of them. What's your explanation? In October of 2008, what were they thinking? What were either the economic ideas or the political forces that made that happen?
Hard to say. And again, I'm not I've somewhat stayed away from that because I never thought that during the time, especially when it was 25 basis points, that it was the most important policy issue that some people do, like Alan Blinder did. I don't think we have a good answer to that. I think everyone was puzzled. Everyone applauded the Fed using the rate paid on reserves as an instrument. In fact, certainly my feeling is that it should be the instrument of monetary policy. But if you ask them what I thought the rate should be, I would have said it should be negative. For example, the European Central Bank currently pays minus 40 basis points. So there's actually a big difference. Now, obviously Europe needs to be stimulated more than the U.S. today, but even today, at 50 basis points, they're paying quite a bit more than they should. And they know that because they've actually created a new kind of reserves, the RRP. This is technical stuff, but they recognize it so fully that they've actually got two kinds of reserves now, and they pay the right interest rate, which is currently 25 basis points on this new kind of reserves. So we're going to, I think, gradually see a swing toward a more reasonable use of this policy instrument by phasing out old-fashioned reserves and then using these new kind of reserves.
I want to make one more, ask more question to capture this idea that the amount of reserves is fixed at the Fed and banks just move it around. So if real interest rates, real productivity of the economy was to grow to say 2-3 historical levels, 2-3%, while the Fed continued to pay 0.5%.
That would be a big surprise.
Right. Well, if that happened, walk me through the chain as banks then tried to get rid of their reserves. What would happen?
So an individual bank would say, "Wow, I can now make a lot more money lending out, even adjusting for risk." For one thing, if the interest rates you're talking about would apply to Treasury bonds, and then 5 or 6% for real with riskier things, right? Okay, but let's say there's a safe interest rate of say 50 to 0.5% that the Fed is paying, and if you go to the Treasury and buy a Treasury bill, which is equally safe and is short term, and you get say 3%, well, it's a no-brainer to spend your reserves to buy Treasury bills from somebody. But then what happens? That person puts it in the bank, and then that bank is saddled with excess reserves. Okay, so the way we used to teach why monetary policy can expand the economy was the same logic that if there were reserves around, which banks were regarded as hot potatoes, they wanted to get rid of them, then as they all collectively started lending more, that would expand the economy. That was the basic theory of why boosting the quantity of reserves, which was traditional monetary policy. This is Milton Friedman monetary policy.
So I was taught.
Quantity of money.
Yeah. Okay. Not interest rates, not that it makes investment look more attractive. Just print money, spend it.
That whole mentality was developed during the time when reserves received zero interest. So everything was based on the quantity of reserves. If the Fed increased the quantity of reserves, it would put hot potatoes in the hands of banks. They would try to lend it out. That would expand the economy. As the economy expanded, then we'd settle into a new equilibrium where the quantity of reserves was what the banks needed to use, and the expansion would stop. Today, we need to remap that into thinking about what happens if you change the interest rate that's paid on reserves. And then the corresponding thing to increasing the quantity of reserves is to lower the interest rate. That low interest rates makes reserves hot potatoes. That expands the economy. So you're describing a situation that would be intensely expansionary.
Correct.
Way more than I think anyone would choose.
Well, the only thing I'm confused about, well, it's probably more than one thing, is that I thought you were going to say is that as they try to acquire those treasuries, that demand's going to push the return on those back down and make it hard for those interest rates. I'm wondering what the interest rate the Fed pays on reserves, how that affects the real interest rate of the economy and the rest of the economy.
It's very persuasive. That is, it simply has to be the case that Treasury bills, which are essentially the same thing as reserves, they're safe obligations of the federal government. They can't pay a return that's very different.
Correct.
So all kinds of things happen, as you were saying. But you're starting from a point where the Fed would never be. They would never be in a situation where market interest rates were that different from what they had chosen to pay on reserves in the new regime. because remember that with $3 trillion of reserves outstanding, they have to make those attractive enough. The stresses that would be caused in the situation you're describing would be, the economy would practically explode because of this difference. So what you'd see is the Fed would never get into that situation. They would be inching up just as they did, and what they're going to do next week is probably add another 25 basis points because they see market rates rising, and they say, well, what matters to us is the difference between what we pay on reserves and market rates, and we have to keep that differential fairly small because we've got $3 trillion of reserves out there. In contrast to the days when there were $17 billion of reserves, where they had a kind of a free hand to, and in fact, in those days didn't pay any interest on reserves and sometimes had a very large differential. But $3 trillion is a very different number from $17 billion.
So what's the significance of that $3 trillion? Is it irrelevant? Is it important?
Well, it's a huge piece of the federal debt. And I
guess that's the right way to think about it.
It would create what economists call a disequilibrium if the identical components of the debt paid different interest rates.
But don't people think? But that's a little bit. Put the treasuries aside. Like you say, let's think those are just the same thing. Out in the real world, there's some level of productivity that normally would be driving interest rates. I think what people are worried about is whether this $3 trillion of 3.2 or whatever it is in the Fed's books is somehow affecting the real economy. And you're saying it's no different than any other debt that the government runs.
Yeah. Well, it could be because the Fed does have a choice about what interest rate to pay. They do have that choice. I believe that what we'll see and what we are seeing and what we'll see next week is they'll track the rise in interest rates and keep the interest rate on reserves, in their case, a little bit above market rates. Blinder and I would say, well, you got that wrong. It should be a little bit below. But to the extent that they start switching reserves, which they could do at any time, from old-fashioned reserves to the modern reserves, which pay a lower interest rate, 25 basis points less, then that would be a sign that they were reducing the subsidy that Blinder and others have been upset about. But I want to emphasize this is not a huge deal. This doesn't compare to some of the important policy decisions that are going to have to be made in our nation's capital soon, which is, can we possibly finance our government?
Well, we're going to save that for another episode. But just to make sure I understand this, if a lot of people will say, well, when are we getting back to normal? So you're saying that it's not so unnormal to have $3 trillion compared to $17 billion because it's just a different form of government debt?
Absolutely. That's what, this question, when Bernanke started expanding the portfolio, very early in that process, he put an essay on the Fed's website. It was a speech that he'd given, which said, look, we have two things we can do when normalization occurs. We could either keep the rate we pay on reserves at a low level and reduce ourselves back to 17 billion reserves. That's strategy one. That's a completely viable strategy. Or strategy two is we can pay market rates on reserves and we can continue to have trillions. And either one of those works fine. So don't worry. We've got two. We have belt and suspenders. And he was right. And I thought he was, and Yellen has continued to make the same point as often as necessary. So I think this idea that there was some kind of inflationary exit they've got two ways to prevent it from happening.
Yeah, I'm just not sure about the political economy there, and I'm not sure the political economy of having fiscal policy the way you've described it centered in the central bank rather than in Congress, and there's less accountability, and I don't know. But
yeah.
Okay, let's turn. I'm fascinated by the NBER dating, business cycle dating. it's a bit strong. I'm fascinated. It's a bit strong, but I am very interested in it. So I want to turn to that now. As far as I understand from the web, you've been the chair of that committee since 1978 when it started, the official. And of course, they're dating for other recessions and booms, healthy times that economists have created, the MBR's created. But since 1978, you've been the chair of this committee that decides when did a recession start, when did it end. What is that like? How often does that committee meet? Do you sit around and for 20 minutes? Do you sit around for 3 hours? Do you argue a lot? How do you proceed to do that? Because a lot of us thought, I did, for example, that, it's easy. It's just when you have 2 consecutive quarters of GDP going down, that's a recession, and then you see how long that goes for, and then then it ends. But that's not what you do exactly. So what do you do?
Okay, well, that first of all, the 2 quarters is a generalization that isn't bad. In particular, our dating of the turning point when the recession began, the most recent recession in December of 2007, fits perfectly. I mean, there's just no controversy about it. On the other hand, if you go back to the recession before that in 2001, that idea kind of breaks down, and it's one thing the 2 quarter thing was in the days when GDP was only measured quarterly, but now GDP is measured monthly.
Correct.
So and that was true actually when we made the decision in 2001, it didn't help. There was kind of a zigzagging of monthly real GDP, not quarterly, but monthly, that still created a big challenge.
And if I remember, there was a revision of the GDP data that changed one of the quarters from negative to positive, I think, net, even though some of the months were negative, maybe.
Yeah, and that's, of course, something we have to live with. So, I mean, one thing about the committee is that, in principle, if we get persuasive new information, we can change the chronology. That's never happened under the time that I've chaired the committee, or when the committee existed. It was done more informally before '78. But we do have that. But anyway, you asked some other questions.
The logistics. Tell me.
So first of all, most of the time the committee does absolutely nothing.
I assume.
That is, it does not meet. It meets as soon as, say, some small number of members of the committee say, "Boy, we better get started here. It looks like this expansion's finally coming to an end, and we're going to have to eventually." Often, a year later, or even sometimes 2 years later, we wait to be sure that we're right. For one thing, the revisions of the data tend to be quite aggressive over the first year. So we wait for the data to calm down, and we also have to deal with the fact that there's a possibility that for example, sometime in the next year, that there might be a pause in the growth of the economy, but then growth resumes. If it resumes quickly enough, we'd say, well, we don't call it a recession. There's a criteria that we apply to decide whether, say, a small negative development is big enough to be called a recession or not. So that's something we, in principle, would have to think about. It's never actually been, it's always been clear to the committee in the time that I've run it. So we've never had something that was just barely a recession. Every recession is either not a recession at all, clearly, or clearly a recession. So that respect, although that's a theoretical problem, it hasn't been a practical problem. The work of the committee, when it's active, is almost all done by email, and since email came into being. So spreadsheets go back and forth, data go back and forth, opinions go back and forth. then, but before we actually make a decision, we have a conference call, and then work it out. Also, another important thing is we have a long discussion of the exact wording of the announcement. That's what clarifies the whole process, is because we put out a press release. The whole thing is very disciplined. It's sort of like what the FOMC does, and we put out a press release, and it explains the logic and what data we're looking at, and things like that.
The FOMC being the Federal Open Market Committee. So
right.
I guess you've ruined some of my illusions. I assumed you sat in a beautiful boardroom somewhere in Cambridge, possibly New York, and pounded the table and argued for June over July. But it just sounds like a civilized process where spreadsheets do most of the heavy lifting. Is there ever any disagreement? Do you guys ever fight?
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, we have to. We do. There's a certain amount of confidentiality that our operating rules require. So I can say yes. There's a frank discussion, but I would be forbidden to say who said what.
I understand. We're almost out of time. I want to get to a big picture question. For me, the Great Recession was a big learning experience, a lot of dimensions, mainly about the role of finance in the economy and the role of how investment banks worked and what leverage did, and that interaction between the financial sector and the real economy. I just was something I didn't know much about and had to learn a lot about, and probably a good chunk of what I learned is not true, but that was one of the things I had to learn, and certainly there was a lot of optimism in October of 2007 or November before the December onslaught of that recession that you mentioned. And a lot of people did claim at the time that we'd kind of figured it all out. And in the aftermath, it seems to me there's sort of there's two groups. There's people who said, yeah, we really did understand it the whole time, and they explain why the last 10 years or 8 years are explicable. And there's another group who say, no, we got to start from scratch, or I got to radically revise my view of the world. One, where do you fall in that group? And two, how do you see the profession as a whole in its response to this event?
Well, I think the first observation I'd make is that there were papers that had been published and were well known in the literature that formed the basis for economists' attention to this question of how financial events affect the whole economy. In particular, Bernanke, Gertler, and Gilchrist paper, which was already famous, became way more famous as a result of being kind of the backbone of the modeling and the upsurge of interest in the subject that obviously occurred after the crisis in September of 2008. So on the one hand, I think it's just completely false to say that we were clueless and we'd never thought about this and that we had to start from scratch. On the other hand, of course, a huge amount of interesting work's been done, stimulated. It's been a huge stimulus to further thinking and further integration of finance. The integration of financial thinking into macro modeling in general has advanced over this period faster than it would have otherwise because it was so clear that the financial crisis triggered a big contraction of activity across the board. But I'm kind of in the middle of that. I'd reject this idea that the profession was completely unprepared, and I never thought of it before. But I also recognize that we didn't see it coming. My wife is an economist who knows a lot about mortgage finance, and we kept a sticker on the refrigerator saying, there's only 250 billion of subprime mortgages out there. It can't be such a big deal.
How important could it be? Oh.
How important could it be? So, we had to take the sticker down sometime, even before September of 2008, we recognized that there was some, the whole spring and summer of 2008 was a time when everyone was getting nervous, and the economy was in fact contracting. So,
well, let me ask
but it was a gradual process.
Let me ask a related question, which is, I don't know if I'm younger than you, but I'm not so young. I'm 62, and I often remind my guests that I went to graduate school in the late 70s, and I went to Chicago, so I was trained with skepticism toward Keynesianism, which seemed to have pervade an increasing portion of the profession as well outside of Chicago. And then with the view that, and certainly our colleague John Taylor will say, oh yeah, everyone knew in 1990 or 1997, don't know what year you want to pick, that Keynesian stimulus is ineffective, short-term stimulus is ineffective. And then we come to the Great Recession, all of a sudden people are Keynesians again, and to some varying amounts, depending on where you go. And I did not realize until preparing for this interview that you are the originator of the saltwater-freshwater distinction in a 1976 paper, saltwater being the coasts, Cambridge and Berkeley and Stanford and MIT, that are more sympathetic to the Keynesian models to some. I mean, there's a lot of difference in distinction. I'm not going to put words in your mouth. But my real question is, do you think we've made progress in our understanding of the business cycle? I was taught by Robert Lucas. He went back to, he was a Mitchell fan. I got some taste of that history. It felt like, again, in 2006, we had really kind of, quote, solved it. Seems like to me we're, to some extent, back to square one. Do you think we've, but maybe not. So tell me your view.
I think a lot of the ideas that had permeated sort of the consensus macro modeling, I think a lot of first of all, the term Keynesian means so many different things to different people. If you look at how most macroeconomists build a model, it has a huge number of things in common. A parting point, in fact, what's called the new Keynesian model isn't related to this question that you mentioned at all. That is whether or not fiscal policy is effective. It all has to do with whether the economy reaches its equilibrium quickly, or whether there's a time when prices are wrong and those prices are sticky, and wages may be sticky. But then there's a lot of work, and this is certainly on the labor market side. This is something that I've contributed to, is applying sort of more standard analysis. Nothing sticky, but other things that sort of mimic stickiness, that represent an equilibrium. So that kind of work is I think has taken us quite a ways, and it's been in place for a while. Lucas's ideas, which just seem so dramatically different from the way we've been brought up, became fully integrated, and now are seen as, well, that's sort of the old-fashioned way of thinking. Rational expectations, that's old-fashioned. The idea is sweeping now that we should model expectations as beliefs that can be different across people, heterogeneous beliefs. And, people in Chicago are just as enthusiastic as anybody about pursuing that kind of idea. There's the idea of schools of macro has pretty much disappeared, especially in the younger generation. It would be impossible to find, an economist in a top universities today who could be reasonably identified to be, well, especially a monetarist, but even a Keynesian in the old-fashioned sense. We all build models in which if the government purchases more, there's higher GDP. It just has to be, and no one would disagree about that today. So if that's the question of what Keynesian means, then Keynes has won completely. We all agree that an important determinant of total activity is how much the government chooses to buy.
Well, I was going to end there, but I can't because I have to challenge that statement. Certainly, there are many, many illustrious economists, far more illustrious than I am. The two that come to mind are Valerie Ramey and Robert Barrow, who've suggested that relationship is not very reliable or doesn't hold at all, or could be negative.
No.
You don't think that's true?
No. You're talking about, first of all, Valerie is a student of mine, and I follow her work very carefully.
But doesn't she say that government spending has little effect on that the multiplier is quite small?
Okay, so her most recent paper says, well, first of all, you have to decide whether you're at the zero lower bound or not. And if you aren't, then $1 billion of government purchases adds about $1 billion to GDP. So the so-called multiplier is 1. And I think that's within the consensus range. It's certainly within my beliefs.
That doesn't stimulate anything, and that's not offset.
Sure does.
That's not offset. That's not worrying whether it's offset by monetary policy.
No, that's assuming that it is offset. Nonetheless, there's an effect. No, by historical pattern of this is poring over historical data.
Correct.
And some old examples of rapid change of government purchases are the main source of the information. So since we haven't had much of it in the last 20 years, this is mostly evidence from more than 20 years ago. But it's the evidence we have, and studies of other countries have been supportive. There's a big literature on this topic. A multiplier of 0, which would mean no effect, is outside the range of almost all empirical work and all modeling. It would not be a viable position, and I know Valerie's work, and Barrow's paper, QJE paper, gets positive multipliers, not large but positive. And there's pretty much agreement now that at zero lower bound, where monetary policy's hands are tied, that multiplier is higher. And that's what Valerie's most recent work shows. So I think it all fits together. But there's nobody who says that it makes no difference at all if the government buys more. And that's a substantive thing that's happening in the economy. Of course, it's going to influence the economy.
Well, we started this conversation by saying that the increase in federal government spending, which went through the states, didn't have much of an impact because they didn't spend it. So
no. We have no clue how much impact it had because it didn't happen. So you have to you learn nothing about the multiplier if nothing happens to government purchases, which is exactly what happened during over the last decade.
My guest today has been Robert Hall. Bob, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
My pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.